Greetings, fellow conservatives across America and around the world. It's Wednesday, 7 p.m., as we are on the same CPAC channel on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And this is our Wednesday edition of CPAC Now. No need to adjust your screens. I'm not Matt Schlapp. I'm not Mercy Schlapp. I'm Ian B. Walters, filling in the anchor desk this week. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our friend, ally, and board member, and heroine extraordinaire, KT McFarland from Florida. KT, how are you?
I'm just great. I'm so excited we're doing this and that you've got it going again, Ian. Well done.
Thank you so much. We needed to have a vehicle to stay in touch with our friends that we meet at CPAC, the folks that watch us across America on the live stream. And as you know, it's tough to determine what's real in this world and what's a conspiracy theory and what's fake news. We've got a little bit of breaking news that I'd like to toss at you. According to some sources, the Government Accountability Office is looking into whether Joe Biden broke the law by violating budget rules when he froze the money meant for Trump's border wall. In addition, some Biden top advisors are heading down to Mexico and Guatemala this week. You have some experience in this topic about whether the executive branch can choose not to spend money that's appropriated by Congress. Did he break the law, KT?
Okay, so this has a long history. 50 years ago, when I was a young kid on the National Security Council in the Nixon administration, Nixon tried to do just that. Money that had been appropriated by Congress, he tried to cancel it out, not spend it. The courts ruled on it and said, no, he's got to spend it. If it's a law that says you got the money, been signed, you got to spend it. And then actually in the Reagan administration, where I was also not quite so young, but a member of the Reagan administration, President Reagan tried to do that again, because as governor of California, Reagan had the right to what are called line item vetoes. So he could go line by line by line in a budget bill and say, well, I don't like that, I'm not going to sign that, but I will sign the other part of it. And Reagan had the authority as governor of California, but he did not have the authority to do that as president. Congress appropriates that money, and the president just has to carry out what the law states. So sadly, for the Biden administration, I think that wall needs to get built.
I think a lot of Americans will agree with you. There's been a media blockout on the southern border. Pictures have begun to eke out this week of what's happening in some of these migrant facilities housing 15,000 kids. A lot of them are being released into communities without there being a court date, leaving the onus on the lawbreaker to check in with the judiciary and with the authorities to say, hey, I need my hearing. I think a lot of people rightly suspect that that's not going to happen, and they will just enter communities and we'll figure out how to have to deal with it. And the Biden approach here on immigration seems to be no approach at all after 4 years of exuding immigration strength at the southern border from President Trump. Is there a national security concern that our audience should be considering when we look at what's happening at the southern border? There have been some reports of people who are on watch lists among the workers crossing north illegally. What's your perspective as far as the national security focus that we see by this crisis that's happening down there in Arizona and Texas?
Well, it's not just a national security problem, but it's an economic problem, it's a humanitarian problem, it's a law enforcement problem, and all those things together feed into a national security issue. I mean, we have long worried that there's a connection, for example, between Iran and Venezuela, that bad guys from Iran are coming to Venezuela and then blending in with the migrant groups and caravans to just get into the United States to wreak havoc. So there's definitely a national security issue in that regard. But economic security is national security. And I look at the situation of where are we now and where are we going to be? Between a $15 minimum wage, which Biden might well get through, and between basically, in all intents and purposes, this is an open border. Anybody can come in. Like you said, they can just disappear into society. That you're now going to have a situation where as we come out of the pandemic, come out of lockdown, the people hardest hit were the low income, unskilled workers. Now, those jobs may not be there anymore because companies will decide, I can't afford the $15 minimum wage. I'm going to automate. It's cheaper. The other part of it, though, is we have these groups of people coming in, unskilled, low-income workers. They're now going to compete with American citizens for those jobs as the remaining jobs open up. So there's that economic national security issue. And frankly, there's a humanitarian issue. And like you said, especially because so many of the people coming over the border now are children, unaccompanied minors, and they're being put in camps. And then when they're released into the public, they're just released. Who knows where they're going? The happy arms of an aunt and uncle, or maybe they're happy arms of sex traffickers. So the image that puts of the United States to the world is you don't have your border under control, you don't have your economy under control, you're dysfunctional, and it just feeds that sense of disappointment of American leadership in the world.
Well said, KT. One of the things that I found so frustrating over the immigration debate from the economic perspective is that a lot of the mainstream media coverage seems to couch conservatives' calls for reform and border strength and border funding as part of a culture war, as if it were linked somehow to the Dr. Seuss stuff from a couple weeks ago, rather than an economic sense. What do you think really is the Democrats' game plan here? Why would they want to have open borders? Is it something as simple as wanting to maintain a Democrat majority in perpetuity? They're doing some math that says that these folks will by and large vote perhaps legally, perhaps illegally, but largely lean Democrat. Is that the real agenda there, or am I missing something about why Democrats are so eager to make sure that there is no enforcement of the laws at the border?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. And it's not just the border issue. You know, Democrats, what's their plan? They want to stay in power forever. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. So what's their plan? They're going to try to make 2 new states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., which they know will be Democrat, and then have an additional 4 Democrat senators forever. They're also talking about packing the Supreme Court with more members of the Supreme Court, other than the 9, an additional couple of members, so that Biden can put his own Democrat members of the Supreme Court. So they're then trying to sort of fiddle with the law. And because they're fiddling at the border and they're letting in who knows how many people, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, they figure those people are going to come over the border. We're going to give them health care. We're going to give them housing. We're going to give them everything. We might even give them some pandemic bailout checks. And therefore, they're going to be loyal members of the Democrat Party and vote Democrats. I mean, the Democrat plan, they don't want to tell you this, but the nasty little secret is that they don't really believe in democracy. They don't believe in two-party system. What they want is locked-in control from now to ever after. And that's why what you're seeing in the woke media, the cancel culture, all of this, it's all part of the same thing. It's government control of the conversation and out the window goes freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of just about anything.
We were able to talk with Gordon Chang yesterday to give us his take on the Anchorage meeting where representatives from the Chinese Communist government met with the new Biden administration official, Secretary of State Blinken. KT, from the clips that I've seen, it looked like it was a real rolling. It was a very aggressive posturing from the Chinese, and the American side seemed to convey a conciliatory tone of some sorts. Is this like an apology tour that we're headed on towards China? What gives?
Look, Anthony Blinken took a knife to a gunfight. The Chinese came ready to roll, and like you said, and they came ready to lambast the United States on American soil and criticize us using our own words against us, right? Who were they quoting? The cancel culture, the woke media, America's racist, America's a warmonger country, I mean, yada, yada, yada. So they came ready to humiliate us and to slap us in the face, in effect. Now, what did the U.S. administration do after that? Instead of getting up and leaving, which is what I would have done, which is what Trump would have done, you get up and you don't insult my country and my own land. They just said, well, you know, we're really trying hard. We know we're not perfect, but America's, you know, pretty good. Whoa, that is just beta dog position, if nothing else. And the reason that's important is because China's gone around the world and they said, America's finished. America is 20th century. We're 21st century. Democracy is dysfunctional. Their economy isn't as strong as ours. We, China, are going to rule the world. We are going to be the dominant economic, military, technological, diplomatic, every other power within the decade. So you better make your peace with us while you can. So if that clip is shown around the world, what are other countries saying? Well, I might not like China. I might not like the economic blackmail. I might not like their wolf warrior diplomacy. I really want to consider myself an ally of the United States, but you know, the United States looks like it's a weak nation. So again, it was a symbolism of what was done. Now, the Biden people, they're talking tough, a little bit of talk, but they don't do anything about it. They immediately apologize. They're not doing what they need to do to retain and maintain America's dominant position in the world.
Boy, you know, President Trump was often accused of, and he may have, of engaging in a trade war with China, with tariffs and economic sanctions. You've often used the term Cold War to describe our emerging relationship with China. You, of course, worked for Ronald Reagan and the Cold War that we all grew up with. And that was a war that we won. The Berlin Wall came down. The USSR was no more. We may not have beaten communism, Marxism, and socialism, but the country was forced to break up, and that's a victory of sorts. Are we at war with China? I know we haven't had a congressional declaration of war since World War II, but is what we are engaged in now with China? It's certainly aggressive. It's certainly doling out penalties for bad behavior where we can on both sides of it. Where does this end, and can we win?
Yeah, well, I think we are in a Cold War, and it's going to be very different from the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union. Now, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union thought they were going to take over the world. I mean, we look at now, we laugh, but they honestly thought they were going to take over the world. So what did the United States do? We did a couple of things. We formed alliances, security alliances and economic alliances with the countries that we had fought alongside with in World War II, as well as the countries who were our adversaries, Germany and Japan. And we created an international system at our expense, but it kept the peace. And then ultimately Reagan understood that the Soviet Union and communism would collapse of its own accord. He just rushed it along and hurried it along with economic warfare. Now, fast forward to today, and I call this Cold War 2.0. The Cold War with China. China thinks it's going to take over the world, absolutely. They don't plan to fight the World War the Cold War, the way we in the Soviet Union did. We in the Soviet Union fought it cold. We didn't actually fight, but we competed with each other with a nuclear arms race and proxy wars around the world. The Chinese don't want to do that. They want to compete with the United States. Their weapons of choice are going to be economic, trade, investment, cyber weapons, and plain old blackmail and what they call wolf warrior diplomacy with other countries. They do not want to fight us, and we don't want to fight them. They know that if they can become the dominant world power economically, they can force other countries through the power of their economy and the power of the trade to do China's bidding. Now, I look at this and say, okay, what we were trying to do in the Trump administration, and Trump would have done in a second term, was to do what the United States did after World War II and what Nixon and Reagan did during the Cold War. Form alliances, in this case in Asia, with Japan, Australia, the United States, and most importantly, India, all countries that the Chinese has zeroed in and wants to dominate. Form an alliance with them. It's called the Quad. But don't just have it be a gab fest where we complain about how bad China is. Have it have real economic teeth, and frankly, have it be a NATO-like military alliance. That's the only way we're going to really stand up to China. And at the same time, we need to really ramp up our technology investment, because China plans to buy, beg, steal, however they can acquire the leading technologies of the future. And once you control the technologies of the future, you control the future. We can't let that happen.
And those of you who are still allowed to be on Twitter know what a strong propaganda game the CCP officials are running on our own American social media platforms. Before I let you go, KT, the Secretary of State, Biden's Anthony Blinken, says that Iran is very close to developing a nuclear weapon. We remember Obama's Iran nuclear deal. ACU opposed that. We talked about it at CPAC. Here comes Donald Trump to say we're going to get out of that bad deal. We're not doing this pallets full of cash to fund terrorism kind of things. Biden seems to be going back to that Obama approach, and a lot of folks in the Middle East are nervous about if Iran is able to develop a nuclear warhead, what that does to the entire region as far as the relationships with us and among all those other countries. What's your sense of where that's headed, and why should we be concerned?
Look, the Iran nuclear deal was it was a fraud. It never stopped Iran's nuclear program. It merely put it on pause for a few years, after which the sunset clauses would kick in and Iran would legally have nuclear weapons. Now, the clock has been ticking since the Obama administration, and Iran, if we rejoin that nuclear deal, then Iran is all that much closer. Within the decade, Iran legally acquires nuclear weapons. So what President Trump did was not just pull out of a stupid deal, but he crushed them economically. Between America's energy independence, between the sanctions against Iran, his goal was to crush Iran economically so that they could no longer be a terrorist nation. They could no longer support terrorists. They'd no longer have the income to do their nuclear program. They'd have a hard enough time having the mullahs stay in office against a restive population, which interestingly, unlike most countries in the world, Iran doesn't blame America for its problems. It blames the mullahs. Trump understood that and wanted to capitalize on that. But if the Biden administration goes back into the Iran nuclear deal, I think it's guaranteed Iran will get nuclear weapons, and not surreptitiously and sneaking behind in the back alley. They'll have them legally, and that will then set off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Money isn't going to be an object for countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. They're all going to want nuclear weapons of their own, particularly because they can't count on the United States. So it's a great tragedy. It was a great situation that Obama and Biden, Obama gave to Trump. He gave him the opportunity. Trump seized it. Biden has an opportunity to make peace in the Middle East, but he just won't take yes for an answer. He wants to screw it up. Why? Because anything Donald Trump did, he just can't abide, and he has to change it, even if it was really working well, like the border, like the Iran policy.
One of my colleagues here in the office, showed here in the studio, handed this to me, and I want to read a little bit to you. This hangs in our ACU headquarters. It's from the White House, Washington, D.C., dated September 28th, 1983. Washington is a city of monuments and memorials to great leaders and noble causes. Sadly, there is no tribute to the millions and millions of helpless, innocent people who have fallen victim to communist oppression. And of course, it's signed by Ronald Reagan and talks about the good work that you were doing in the 1980s, that we were doing here at ACU in the 1980s. KT, thank you so much for joining us. I always learn so much. My IQ goes up several points every time I get to hear your approach and your voice on these important topics. Thanks again for joining us at CPAC, and thanks for joining us on CPAC Now today, KT.
Thank you. It's an honor and it's a real pleasure. Thanks, Ian.
Stick around, folks. We'll be back in just a moment for our second part on today's Wednesday edition of CPAC Now. And we're back with our next interview here on CPAC Now. It gives me great pleasure to be able to bring to you, our CPACtivist audience and around the world, the Washington editor of The Spectator, Amber Athey. Amber, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for joining us. One of the reasons I've become such a fan of you and so interested in promoting Spectator and all of the good work that you do is that you still care about journalism and getting the facts right. And in a world where it is difficult to determine what's real and what's fake, I want to make sure that our audience knows that they can always count on you to shoot straight. We're waiting with eager anticipation for the Thursday press conference where Joe Biden will finally make himself available to reporters to answer the tough questions on maybe immigration, maybe the Second Amendment. You wrote a great article last week as a preview for that event. What's your sense of how this is going to go on Thursday?
Well, here's the problem. The Biden administration has been pretty notoriously tough on press access in the White House. They've, of course, blamed the COVID-19 pandemic for all of the new rules that they've implemented since Trump left office. But what it means in practice is that there are very few actual reporters who will be at this press conference. So far, in a normal press briefing, you get about a dozen reporters, and they've only added a few extra seats for the press conference, and the seats were handed out through a lottery system. So there's really only going to be about 20, maybe less than that, reporters that are able to question Joe Biden. And pretty much all of them are from the biggest mainstream outlets like CNN, NBC, Politico, all of the outlets who normally have an assigned seat in the briefing room. So if anyone is expecting this to be a press conference where you have independent and conservative reporters in there actually asking about the issues that you care about and asking tough questions, I'm afraid to say that it's probably not going to happen.
We've seen over the course of the 2020 campaign how dangerous it can be to lower the expectations, lower the bar for Joe Biden's performance. It seems that when it's crunch time, when it's important, he's capable of delivering, whether it's the speech at the convention or at the inauguration, that sometimes saying that he's old and not with it and has medical problems, that can end up working in his favor. Which Joe Biden do you expect we'll see on Thursday? The one who's crisp and sharp and well rehearsed, or do you think we'll get the stammering fellow who's not quite sure how to handle his left flank?
I think we'll see the well-rehearsed Joe Biden, only because he has had several weeks now to prepare for this press conference. It is actually pretty insane that his team announced it so early, and gave him time to prepare for whatever questions of the day were going to be. I can imagine that he probably spent a lot of time with his team fielding tough questions as practice. But when he gets in the actual room, the real challenges that he'll have are going to be from a very small handful of reporters. And, the one that comes to the top of my mind is Fox News' Peter Doocy, who's been incredibly tough on White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. But outside of that, he's going to be taking questions from all of these reporters who presumably voted for him in the election and were quite happy that he took over from former President Donald Trump.
Jen Psaki is often finding herself in the hot seat with Peter Doocy. He does ask the tough questions. There were a lot of tough questions asked in that briefing room when Donald Trump was president. Joe Lockhart, who was one of Bill Clinton's press secretaries, I think post-impeachment, wrote a piece in the Washington Post, and he said that he fears the press corps won't be able to resist walking in with the mentality of, we're going to show all the MAGA people we can be just as tough on Biden as we were on Trump. I'm interpreting that to mean, hey, hand-selected lottery winners in the press briefing room, don't be too tough. Don't act like Jim Acosta. Are they looking for a free ride from some of their colleagues in the fourth estate, you think?
It certainly sounds like that's what he's saying. He's warning them, don't fall into a trap of doing what you're supposed to do, which is holding this guy accountable for all of the blunders that have occurred during his first couple of months in office. He is telling them to resist the temptation to put politicians' feet to the fire, which is ultimately the job of journalists. That he is telling them to ignore their instincts, ignore all of the criticism from people across the country, as well as conservatives, which is, the reason that trust in media is so low is that they refuse to be tough on Democrats and they are the opposite on Republicans. To ignore that instinct means the press is going to continue declining in the eyes of the American public because they refuse to do their most basic duty.
That is, I hope, not a dying attitude, but an attitude that I hope that your colleagues and fellow reporters across the spectrum can embrace. A few years ago, a publication sent a reporter to CPAC, and that publication was Teen Vogue. They interviewed 13 young women from who attended CPAC. It was a fairly competent write-up, but the treatment and the framing of that piece that put Teen Vogue on my radar was that they treated some of the delightful young women who attended CPAC as sort of circus animals, or as if it were a zoo, and we could see females in their natural state there in National Harbor. How could a woman possibly be supportive of Trump? How could a young woman who has just graduated college or still in college possibly be pro-life? A lot of the folks that attend CPAC, they don't take those mainstream talking points. That being said, the editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue, or the newly appointed editor, found herself the victim of cancel culture because of some tweets that she had written when she was a younger person, and she's not that old. I think her name is Alexi McCamm. And you did another piece that was wonderful. It sort of dissected what that was all about, the woke digital mob beginning to eat its own. What do you think caused the uproar that led to her dismissal, and then the subsequent uproar over her colleague that led to the dismissal in the first place?
Right. So what happened here was that Alexi McCammon had sent out several racially insensitive tweets when she was in high school, and these tweets were quickly resurfaced when she was appointed as editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. And the writers there were not happy about this, that they had an alleged racist heading up the magazine, and they swiftly called for her dismissal. She tried to apologize again, even though she had already done so several years in the past, and it was not enough for the woke mob. They needed to have her head. She ultimately resigned from the publication. Now, on one hand, I feel for her because a similar thing happened to me, where Media Matters pulled up my old tweets from when I was in high school and used them as proof of me still being a bigot to this day. And there's really no grace in our society for people when they make mistakes as kids and then grow up. However, that being said, Alexi McCammon, over the past several years, has been cheering on cancel culture. She's someone who actively participates in the leftism that cancels people for the most minor of sins and makes sure that the crime is always much more aggressive, or the crime is never as aggressive as the punishment. The punishment never fits the crime. And so when I see conservatives defending her and saying that this shouldn't have happened to her and we need to feel sorry for her, it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit, because when this happens on our side, when conservatives get canceled, all of these same people are silent. They don't say anything to defend their own people, but then they want to act super principled when they can chime in with the rest of the mainstream media and say that this specific situation was unfair. So I say, let them eat their own. It is the only way that they will ever learn that cancel culture is dangerous and that it is a cancer on society.
It is a sad reflection of the world we're living in that high schoolers behaving like high schoolers is somehow going to haunt them throughout the rest of their career and perhaps limit their career options. When we elevate people like David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez and then treatment of the Covington kids, we all know how that ended up for Nick Sandmann. Of course, Brett Kavanaugh's high school calendars were the stuff of breaking news during his nomination process. Amber Athey, thank you so much for joining us. When I give remarks around the country about media bias and things like that, often people will say, well, Ian, what can we do? You've identified problems with the New York Times, with Politico, with the Washington Post. What I tell them to do is open up your wallet and support CPAC and support conservative media. And that means being willing to get behind the paywall to make sure that we can retain great journalists, great reporters like Amber Athey, the Washington editor of Spectator. Amber, you have the last word. Where can we read your stuff and how can people stay in touch with you?
Absolutely. Please go to spectator.us, and as Ann said, consider subscribing. If you use my discount code AMBER, you will get 10% off your subscription, and we always appreciate your support.
That's fantastic. Amber Athey, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for joining us today on CPAC Now. Join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern for another edition of CPAC Now.